The Kalb Report is funded by a grant from the Ethics and Excellence in Journalism Foundation. From the National Press Club in Washington, D.C., this is the Kalb Report with Marvin Kalb.
Hello and welcome to the National Press Club and to another edition of the Kalb Report. I'm Marvin Kalb, and our subject tonight, writing history. Bob Woodward, Carl Bernstein, and journalism's finest hour. That was, of course, their coverage of the Watergate scandal. The break-in, the scandal, the cover-up, the toppling of the president. There have been other great, finest hours in American journalism, but Watergate probably is at the very top or close to it. At the time, a little more than 40 years ago, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein were both very, very young reporters at the Washington Post. On June 17, 1972, 5 men tried bugging the Watergate office of the Democratic National Committee. They're caught. Woodward and Bernstein begin to cover the story. President Richard Nixon is at the heart of a cover-up. On August 8, 1974, Nixon resigns almost certainly one step ahead of impeachment. And God, what a story and what a moment in American history. I am delighted, honored, really, to have both of you, Bob and Carl, here on the Kalb Report. And Bob, you had been at the Post for all of 9 months, working as, I think, a nighttime police reporter when you were assigned to cover Watergate. To put it in its most charitable way, you were not the most experienced reporter on big deal Washington politics, and yet you got the story. So tell us how it happened.
Well, a series of accidents. That morning, the editor sat around and said it was a beautiful day in Washington, a Saturday, and they said, who would be dumb enough to come in to work? And my name rose to the top of the list. And they sent me down to the courthouse to cover the arraignment of the 5 burglars. And as Carl has always said, Carl covered burglars for, a dozen years at that point. You never had them in business suits. And there they were. And the judge asked where the lead burglar had worked, and he didn't want to answer. He kept whispering, and finally the judge said, where? And he said, CIA. And I was in the front row, and my reaction was, holy. And that began a series of clues. I mean, Carl, of course, that day was working anyway, right?
Well, I was the chief Virginia reporter of the paper at the time. And
how long had you been at the paper then?
Well, I started at the Washington Star when I was 16. So by then I had 12 years experience, and I've been at the Washington Post for 6 years. But I was writing a story about the lieutenant governor of Virginia running for the governorship, and I could see all this commotion around the city desk, and I said to myself, that's a better story, whatever it is up there, than the one I'm working on. So I went up there to find out what it was, and I started to make some calls without being asked to, and eventually the city editor said, okay, keep making calls, and that day I got hold of the burglars' wives in Miami and tried to talk to them in pidgin Spanish, but learned a little bit.
And the next day was Sunday, and there were 2 reporters who came in
Who were
on
stupid
that
enough
Sunday.
to be there on a Sunday.
Carl and myself, and we did our first story together about James McCord, the lead burglar, and his connections to the CIA, but also he was head of security for the Nixon campaign. And that was, what?
So this meant that almost within the first 24, 48 hours, you already had clues linking what they had done to the White House.
And of course, the White House then called it a third-rate burglary to which it had no relationship whatsoever. And of course, as we know now, it turned out to be the key to understanding that the Nixon presidency was a criminal presidency almost from beginning to end, and that Richard Nixon was a criminal president of the United States.
When did that thought, this criminal president, all that business, enter your mind?
Well, we had a story about 10 weeks into, after the Watergate break-in, in which we wrote that John N. Mitchell, Nixon's campaign manager and former law partner, had, while being Attorney General of the United States, controlled a secret fund that paid for Watergate and other undercover activities against the political opposition. And I'll tell this story now. I'm going to take a second. So the White House immediately said that story, when we called them for a comment, said the sources of the Washington Post are a fountain of misinformation. And we typed out their response. And I said to the press secretary, well, is the story right? Did Mr. Mitchell control the funds? The sources of the Washington Post are a fountain of misinformation. So I had a phone call for a phone number for John Mitchell in New York, and I called him, and I said, Mr. Mitchell, Attorney General, sir, we have a story in tomorrow's paper I'd like to read to you. And he said, go ahead. I said, all right, well, it says, John N. Mitchell, while Attorney General of the United States, controlled a secret fund, and I got that far. And Mr. Mitchell said, Jesus. And I got a few more words into the paragraph, and Mr. Mitchell said, Jesus. And then he said, Jesus Christ, all that crap you're putting it in the paper, if you print that, Katie Graham, referring to the publisher of the Washington Post, Katharine Graham, is going to get her tit caught in a big fat ringer. And I was not used to speaking to attorneys general, and I kind of instinctively jumped back from the phone myself, worried about my own parts more than Mrs. Graham's, perhaps. And then he said, and when this campaign is over, we're going to do a little story on YouTube, boys, and hung up the phone. And
at which point you knew.
Well, at which point it was a very chilling moment for a 28-year-old reporter.
And then you called Bradley.
We called Ben Bradley, our great editor, told him what Mitchell had said, and Bradley said, he really said that? And I said, yeah. And Bradley said, do you have it in your notes? And I said, yeah, I typed them all out. He said, all right, put it all in the paper, but leave out her tit.
That's what's called great editing.
That's what's called great editing. Was that one of the reasons, by the way, that telling this story, was that one of the reasons why from the very beginning you both knew that you were onto something not just journalistic, but historic, and you began to keep every note that you ever had, every report?
We
because
did that
in and of itself is rather unusual.
Well, no, I mean, you write everything down, you try to keep a record. It was clear this was an important story, but Mitchell's threat to Carl is important because can you imagine Eric Holder, the Attorney General, now saying that to a reporter, even if he thought it? No, because it would get out and it would become a big deal. But Mitchell felt so insulated, felt so protected by the White House, by our political system, and quite frankly, by the press, that he could talk that way.
What do you mean, protected by the press?
Exactly that. I mean, no one picked that up. It was a kind of, oh yeah, isn't that interesting that John Mitchell just threatened the publisher of the Washington Post?
And remember, most of our colleagues in the Washington press corps at the time did not believe the stories that we were writing for the first couple months in Watergate, including many of our colleagues at the Washington Post.
And right at that time, we were having coffee one morning in the little cafeteria they had off the newsroom, and Carl it was a dime.
In those days.
You could get a cup of coffee for a dime. Wasn't very good, but as you've said, in this, I mean, I watched this, you felt a chill go down your back, and you turned around to me and you said, my God, this president is going to be impeached. And my response was, I think you're right, but we can never, ever use that word in this newsroom because people will think we have a political agenda. And that was the fall of 1972, and it was a year before the whole impeachment drive began. So we had a glimpse of it, but we had to be really careful because, as you may recall, Marvin, at the time, the White House was unloading on us in a way that unprecedented. Ron Ziegler, the press secretary for Nixon, would just say, the Washington Post is engaged in a political campaign. Ben Bradley, the editor over there, was a friend of John Kennedy's, and on and on and on. All the other Republican operatives would give speeches. Bob Dole went up to Baltimore and gave a speech that went on and called us every name in the book. And so we're in a foxhole to a certain extent on all of this.
No, it's an interesting point. It takes off in many directions, but on the foxhole, for example, Carl, I read somewhere recently that you were describing the relationship that you had with Bob as being in a kind of foxhole. And you also said that it was very warm, friendly, but you did acknowledge that you had disagreements. Some of them, you said, very heated.
Yeah.
Could you give us a sense of what one might be?
You said warm and friendly?
You know, like a State Department spokesman.
I mean, we were
It's been going on
stalking
for
each other.
40 years.
Yeah.
Now, have you guys been at loggerheads all that time?
No,
Well, we look at things differently, but as you pointed out, I'd been working at the Post for 9 months, and it's great to have a partner like Carl, who's been there forever. I think you go back to the Calvin Coolidge administration.
At least.
But the great thing that happened is that we complemented each other, and we switched roles all the time. What would be expected of me, Woodward would do. What would be expected of Woodward, I would do, in terms of writing, in terms of reporting. And
Give us an example of the very heated argument.
Well, there's a story that we wrote that said that Chuck Colson, the president's deputy assistant, political operator, and John Mitchell had really been behind the Watergate operation and the whole huge campaign of political espionage and sabotage that Watergate was a part of. And we had the goods on the story, so I thought we had a number of people saying that this was the case. Bob didn't think that the story was ready to go, and he prevailed.
And we had a big fight about it. And
Actually,
I thought
it says in the book, and all the president said was probably the biggest argument we ever had, and it was a hugely important story.
And,
Well, how did
and
it
it was
work out?
never published, and the agreement we had over another
Cup of
10-cent cup of coffee was if somebody said no, okay, no prevailed.
That's right.
And
You mean if one,
If one of us said no, and it
You
even
would not
applied,
go with the
it
story.
even applied to the lead of a story.
but what's interesting about this story, never published, Newsweek last week has a cover story
The reinvented Newsweek.
saying that they have a copy of this unpublished article, and they have drawings of the two of us on, Beyond Deep Throat, some of the other secret sources that we had, and they feel like they've uncovered a dinosaur bone that didn't even run, wasn't even in the dinosaur, and that's 42 years
no, it's
later.
an amazing story, wonderful story.
And it just, we were kind of looking at it, and, I had to plead guilty and say we should have run that story.
Better late than never.
Yeah, right, exactly.
The thing that's kind of interesting to me, you mentioned a moment ago Bob Dole going up to Baltimore, ripping into the two of you. That had to have had some kind of play within the establishment of the Washington Post.
Well,
Not everybody was Ben Bradley. Not everybody was Kay Graham. There must have been people who went to Kay Graham and said, "What are you doing?
Well, Henry
You're allowing
Kissinger-
these two maniacs to go running."
Henry Kissinger did, who was then the national security advisor.
I know, but he's not on
to
paper. I'm interested, was
oh,
there-
yes, no, the national editor of the paper, somebody that we love deeply, actually, and worked
But he
with
said
later, he went to Ben Bradley and said that, look, he didn't have confidence in what we were writing, and he would like the national staff, not the local staff of which we were a part, to take the story over. And Bradley said no, that these guys are coming in with the information, and as long as that's the case, they're on the story.
Let me ask you about Ben Bradley, and we know, by the way, that as we tape this program, and it's going out live to a lot of people, Ben is very ill at this point. But if you go back to Ben Bradley was a giant in this industry. And Ben, as your editor, every now and then I have the feeling he might have been more important, really, to getting the story out to the public than the two of you.
Absolutely.
Because without him, am I right, nothing would have happened.
Absolutely.
Well, I mean, if he wouldn't publish these stories, Carl and I could have written letters to our mothers, and that circulation was
Which
not.
he had published.
Was not much, but Ben was.
And his mother didn't believe what we were writing.
That's right.
She was from the Chicago Republican machine.
Right, she did. When Nixon said in the Frost interviews that what we wrote was trash, and that we were trash, I was, that's tough stuff. And so I called my mother, and I asked her, what do you think about the former leader of the free world calling us trash? And she said, oh, that's Washington, that's politics, and so forth. And she said, what's this about being a Republican?
I want to know, Bob.
But Ben was for us at that time, I mean, we were in our late 20s, and he had all this experience. He was the boss, and he knew how to motivate people. He knew how to interrogate us in a way. If you've ever been interrogated by Ben Bradley, he won't just ask, kind of, have you got something in your note? It's exactly what was said.
Did you share everything with Ben?
No, he did not he did not ask who a couple of sources were. He wanted to know where they worked, essentially, but he did not need to know their names. But one of the things that's so significant about Ben is that here's an editor without a real politics, whose real politics is about the truth. And that is what guided him in his career, guided him in his life, and that is why he was such a tough editor on us and put us through these paces and knew how what the stakes were very early in this story. And he too wouldn't publish some stories very early on. There was a story we had done about Ted Kennedy being investigated by the Nixon White House, and he took a look at it and marked it up and said, well, it's certainly not going on page 1. I'll put it inside the paper, but that's it. He was tough on us, as he should have been.
You once said, Bob, that Bradley was great because, quote, what he kept out of the paper as much as what he got into the paper. Give us an example of something that he would look at the two of you square in the eye and said, guys, this won't make it, not going to make the paper.
All the time we were going through a process of this is what, Ben's favorite line always was after you did a story, say, okay, what have you got for tomorrow? He was always thinking about the next paper. And that's the right attitude. And so we would share, and there would be meeting. We had great editors on the Metro staff, Barry Sussman, Harry Rosenfeld. Howard Simons was the managing editor. And there was, we would mix it up and talk. And we could work 2 or 3 weeks on a single story and write them on things called typewriters. I think some people remember what those were.
Manual typewriters,
yeah,
no electric typewriters.
Yeah, you needed finger pressure.
You need both fingers.
And send copies around to everyone. They would say, well, what about this? What about that? Check this out, and so forth. And so it worked. But the really interesting thing about Bradley was he knew we were going into a really well-organized, well-funded criminal conspiracy by the Nixon White House and the Nixon campaign.
When did he know that?
I think the time we did the Mitchell story.
So it's only 3 or 4 months into the story.
Yeah,
itself.
yeah, and he said, you're about to accuse the Attorney General, former Attorney General of the United States, of being a crook. You better be right.
What an amazing thing, the amount of trust that he vested in the two of you. How do you account for that? Did he really think you were that great?
No, he had the greatest of instincts based on this questioning methodology, but he had perfect antenna. He was a great reporter before he was an editor, and because his bottom line and top line was about the truth, he would make sure that that story was truthful in fact, in context, every element of it, and it was like being in boot camp.
Did you guys ever think that that your lives were ever in danger?
Yeah, we did. Mark Felt, Deep Throat, said, I think it was in May '73, said the stakes are so high in this. Lives could be in danger. I think I overreacted to it a little bit. He wasn't saying our lives.
He didn't specifically say
He
your
said,
life.
perhaps including your own.
Yeah,
was
that's right.
His
yeah.
language.
Yeah,
I remember it.
and
Did you take any steps?
Okay, well, here's what we did. I mean, this is the way it was. Talk to him. I come back, type out the notes, and Carl and I are going through this, and wiretapping's going on all over the place. Lives could be in danger. Essentially, this is going to explode. Nixon's going to be involved, and so Carl never served enough time in the military, so he never observed the chain of command. He said, we've got to go see Bradley. It's 2 a.m. in the morning.
See, he was a lieutenant, and I was in E1.
Yeah,
that's
right.
the difference.
And so call Bradley. We go out to his house, and on Dexter in Wesley Heights, and Ben, and he opens the door. He's there in his bathrobe, and we say, come on outside, because there's wiretapping going on. And he finally thinks we've finally gone nuts, and he comes out, and we tell him this, and there's the movie version of it, which is a little inflated, where Jason Robards playing Bradley says, okay, go take a bath, get back to work. Not much is at stake other than the freedom of the press, the future of the country, and
the Constitution.
And the Constitution. Right. That was all. And we looked back at our notes again, and you know what he said? This is interesting, and reflective of him. He looked at us and said, what the hell do we do now? Which, if you think about it, this is in totally uncharted territory. And that's exactly the right question. What the hell do you... And so we met the next day up on the garden court at the Washington Post, and the other editors are really certain we have gone nuts at this point. And we start... what's the next story? What are we going to do? And as you may recall, for 26 months until Nixon resigned, that story was, every week, sometimes 3 or 4 front-page stories on the in the Washington Post. It had as Ben has said, at the time of the Senate Watergate hearings, you could, in the newsroom at the Post, the little TVs were going, watching the hearings. All the networks covered them.
Oh, yeah.
Gavel to gavel. You go get in a cab, and the cab driver would have the hearings on the radio, and then you get up and go to some office in the Hill, and you would go in there, and they'd all be watching this. This was a subject that was it consumed this town and, to a certain extent, the country.
Let me ask both of you this question. You were so deeply into this story. I mean, few journalists really have an opportunity to get into any story as deeply as you did into the Watergate story. And I'm wondering, for that reason, is there any part of the Watergate story that is still out there, that has not yet been discovered?
Well, we keep getting on the Nixon tapes, month after month, year after year.
No, but that's
new elements.
Yes, but are there people like the two of you today, perhaps at the Washington Post or anywhere else, who are going after a story like this, that there's an element of Watergate that is still out there? Or can one say properly that Watergate as a story, big banner across it, it's done?
Well, it's never done, and it's Ben Bradley used to always say, still says, the truth emerges, and it takes a lot of time. But now, let's take an example of the Washington Post. Let's take the Secret Service. If we were talking 3 months ago and we took a poll and we said, what do you think of the Secret Service? People would say, great organization, there's been no shooting, no one's been hurt, and so forth. And now, because of Carol Lenig's reporting at the Washington Post, take a poll about the Secret Service. Gee, they let people jump the fence and get into the White House?
Secret Service is not in the league with Watergate, Bob.
Okay, I'm not talking about magnitude. I'm talking about the point, and this is the point in Watergate. We didn't know what was going on. The conventional wisdom was Nixon was too smart to be involved. Turned out not to be the case. We used to think, the Secret Service is this premier organization. Somebody does some reporting and they say there are all kinds of problems. It connects because reporting is necessary.
I mean, is there a Watergate out there?
Well,
Are you
but
implying?
that's not-
The real question is there great reporting going on? And there is
that's not-
great
no.
reporting.
No,
well,
that is not my question. My question relates specifically to Watergate-type stories.
What do you mean? You mean
You know what Watergate
well,
is.
you
Is
mean
there another Watergate out there?
Well, you mean the President of the United States? What about the great stories that the Boston Globe did about the Catholic Church, priests, and pedophiles? Right. That is an incredible piece of reporting, one of the greatest pieces of reporting in the last 50 years. Yeah.
But he is asked, I mean, we don't know.
Right, you got to do the reporting.
We don't know whether there's a Watergate there. I mean, I've done a couple of books on President Obama, and President Obama has lots of problems. There's lots of criticism of him. But as one of his aides said, Obama has the armor of a good heart. And I think that is true. I have seen in my report, it doesn't mean it's not there, but I've seen no evidence that this sort of Watergate-like activity is going on in the Obama administration.
I just want to take a moment now to remind our radio and television and online listeners and viewers that this is the Kalb Report. I'm Marvin Kalb, and I'm talking with who are you?
Whatever the hell your names are.
All about Watergate and America and journalism. Richard Nixon. You were covering him. What were your feelings about Nixon then, and what are your feelings about him now? Have they changed? Why? Let's start with Carl.
I come from a left-wing political background that had always been suspicious about Richard Nixon. My view coming into this story was that the President of the United States, Richard Nixon or anyone else, would have nothing to do with this kind of activity. That was my view. In fact, I wrote a memo at first saying why I thought perhaps the CIA was involved in it. Then eventually I thought, well, might be perhaps one of Nixon's political operatives. But it took a long time till we got hard information.
It took about 4 months, though. It took only 4 months, 3 or 4 months.
I know, but have your views changed?
Yes.
You asked about Nixon, and are there unanswered questions about Watergate? And I think the main question that is unanswered is why. Why he had risen to become President of the United States, and he never understood. and this is a point Carl made years and years ago, never understood the goodwill that is visited upon a newly elected president, and from both parties, because if the president succeeds, the country succeeds.
Till this particular president today.
And then you listen to the tapes and the rage and the hate and the using the power of the presidency to settle scores endlessly. But, you know, why? Why not kind of, you know, it's like Nixon's at the casino and he has actually won all the money and he can't, you know, he wants to see if, you know, one of the dealers has $20 in his pocket and he wants to get that too.
Bob, it's so interesting what you're saying now. I have a question. Well, I'm saying to myself, as I wrote this question, that everyone at the time who covered Nixon in one way or another was touched by this man. I was CBS's diplomatic correspondent at that time. Nixon put me on his enemies list. To this minute, I haven't a clue as to why. I have no idea. He tapped my phone. I don't know why. He audited my income tax. Nothing, not a penny out of line. He had people break into my CBS office twice. Why? It's the same question you're asking. Was it because I, as a reporter, criticized his Vietnam policy? Is that what it's all about? Or is there more to this guy going on?
If you listen to the tapes, you hear the vengeance toward those he perceives as his political enemies or those who he believes constrain his ability to do what he wants to do as the President of the United States, beginning with the anti-war movement. And Watergate really begins with the anti-war movement and Nixon setting up the anti-Vietnam War movement, and Nixon setting up an illegal apparatus to wiretap, break in, put under surveillance, mail covers of people in the anti-war movement. And we hear him now on the tapes say, I know this is illegal, but we have to do it.
And no president can admit that he authorized that.
That's what Nixon
says. This is the
says.
secret Houston plan, and of course, thank God we've got the tapes, because there he is acknowledging that it is illegal.
In the first weeks and months of his presidency.
And
That's right.
We've broken this down to, you know, there were 5 wars, 5 Nixon wars. The first was the anti-war movement. The second one was
Excellent
against...
piece in the Washington Post 2 years ago.
Pardon?
That's the one you did in the Post 2 years ago.
Yes, exactly. But the second one is a war against the press. You're an example of that.
Yeah.
Let's tap telephones because of what you were writing, or maybe people were leaking to you. The third war was against, so he didn't like the anti-war movement, he didn't like the press, didn't like, third group, the Democrats. They're going to try to win
an election,
the presidency. And so we have to set up this whole apparatus of not just the Watergate burglary, but massive sabotage, you know, espionage all over the place. And then the fourth war was the longest war while Nixon was there, and that was the war against justice, the obstruction of justice, the cover-up. And then the fifth one went on for more than 20 years, and that was Nixon's war against history, to try to say, oh, no, it's just a blip, it's a little thing, I was misunderstood. And again, we have those tapes. Which if you listen to these tapes, if you actually put the headphones on, I think it should almost be a requirement of citizenship.
Every good course.
If you listen 1 year to the day before the break-in at Watergate, Nixon, Henry Kissinger, H.R. Haldeman, Nixon's chief of staff in the Oval Office, are talking about some documents in a safe across town in the Brookings Institution, a think tank.
I want to ask you about that.
A think tank here in town. That Haldeman says if they can get hold of those documents, they can blackmail, is the word that Haldeman used, Lyndon Johnson. He means smear, because the documents, they believe, will show that Johnson's conduct of the Vietnam War was even worse than Nixon's. And you'll remember there's this great movement against the war now. And so they say, well, we really want to get these documents. And Nixon says, crack the safe, firebomb the damn place. I don't care what you have to do to get those documents. I want them. Break
I
in,
have the exact,
break, go ahead.
I have the
give the
exact quote here.
Go ahead.
Because I think it's kind of interesting. He turns to Haldeman and he says, God damn it, get in and get those files. By the way, the files it was presumed that there was a Johnson file on Vietnam that Nixon wanted very much. He says, God damn it, get in and get those files. Blow the safe and get it. Get on the Brookings thing right away. I've got to get that safe cracked over there. Well, now clearly something was cracked.
The President of the United States saying this.
No, but what I want to get at here, to the best of my knowledge, they never did anything about Brookings. Now, but it's interesting.
Nixon returns to it time and time again
but
the next
Carl,
13 days.
Hang on. My question is, the way the presidents work, the way that staffs work around him, Haldeman must have known that Nixon goes off the deep end at least 3 times a day. If we pursued 3 things every day, we'd all go crazy. So let's just do 1 a day and ignore the others. Because
That's
they might have
what
thought,
Haldeman writes in his book, as a matter of fact. That's a pretty good equation of it.
Well, you have to, at a certain point, and I imagine this happens with President Obama as well, people very close to him listen to him explode about an issue, perfectly natural, and most of the time they'll go and do something. Sometimes they don't. President Kennedy used to wonder, why is it that I give an order, we shut down those missiles in Turkey, 6 months later he finds out nobody touched the missiles in Turkey.
Yeah.
So presidents give orders that are not necessarily followed. It's kind of interesting.
Yeah, it's more than interesting, but the significance of that tape, Nixon, Haldeman, and Henry Kissinger.
Yes.
Now, where is Henry Kissinger
saying,
hey, wait a minute, we don't blackmail
former presidents.
Earlier presidents. We don't do this. This is a touchy subject, but you've got to deal with it. The anti-Semitic comments by Nixon on the tapes with Kissinger there.
Not once does he say, Mr. President, I'm a refugee from Nazi Germany. Please don't talk that way.
No, but what Nixon does do, he does at one point say in the article that you guys both wrote, that as far as the Jews were concerned, he pointed to Len Garment, he pointed to Kissinger, he pointed to Bill Safire, and he said that they were good Jews. They were okay. It's the others that we can't trust. And in other words,
you can never trust the bastards.
You can never trust the bastards is exactly the line.
I mean, I'm sorry, it's awful.
Yes,
There's
right.
no way.
I'm not defending it.
Okay,
Come on, what are you, nuts?
And it's endemic.
Yeah, and it's about, at the end, the day Nixon resigned, he had that farewell address in the East Room of the White House. And he called his senior staff, cabinet officers, and friends there. And there was no script. He was sweating, if you recall. It was televised live. He talked about his mother and his father, and no one will write a book about my mother, and there was just a book about Rose Kennedy out at the time. And then he kind of waves his hand like, this is the summation to the jury. This is, and you have to give him credit for what he said, and this is why I called you here, implied. And then he says precisely, always remember, others may hate you, but those who hate you don't win unless you hate them, and then you destroy yourself.
Do you think he believed what he was saying at that
time? At the moment he kind of decoded himself, and he realized that hate was the piston of so many things, and that, in fact, that hate had destroyed him because he was resigning. And I think there was a flash of clarity there, an unscripted, unwritten line about hate. And if you look at all of this stuff, and we're talking about Obama and the armor of a good heart, I don't think Obama hates. I don't think Clinton hated. I don't think the Bushes hated. I think that this is, as Carl says, a unique precedent in terms of the criminality and the mindset of, I mean, listen to those tapes.
The dog that never barks. The dog that never barks on the tape is the President of the United States saying, what would be good for the country? Not once in all the tapes we know of has he said that.
Or his aides.
Or his aides.
What would be
what
good?
Would be
what
good
would be
for
right?
the country, for
It's
the
all about
national
Nixon.
interest?
It's all about promoting him or some public relations advantage or some, you know, we go back and look at this stuff in that article 2 years ago, and we were just kind of saying to ourselves, real honestly, say, you know, we understated.
This is much worse than we wrote about, absolutely. But there's one other element about this, and that is Vietnam, that we now know from the tapes that Nixon and Kissinger discuss why we cannot pull out of Vietnam, knowing that we're losing and we cannot win, but that really continuing in Vietnam is a foreign policy move to encourage the rift between the Russians and the Chinese. Meanwhile, after they recognize that, 25,000 more American soldiers are killed.
28,000.
28,000. And God knows how many people who are citizens of Cambodia, Vietnam, etc. It is the single most cynical thing I think I've ever encountered.
And you and your daughter wrote the book, Haunting Legacy, about Vietnam. And I think it's haunting legacy right now as we're entering a new war in the Middle East.
Yes.
And you know, what do you extract from it? But Carl, I mean, that tape of the leader of the free world, the President of the United States, his national security advisor, just in a sense, anting up thousands of lives for
geopolitical strategy.
Yeah.
Let me shift subjects for a moment. I want to talk to you about where journalism is today, where you think it may be going. And let me just ask you, Carl, are you a fan of the new media?
I'm a fan of great reporting when it's done by the new media.
Ah.
There's not enough of it done by the new media, but there's some great stuff. Look at what ProPublica, this consortium of reporters, is doing. There's a lot of great reporting out there.
I'm not sure that ProPublica you put into the category of the new technology. They're using
That's my point. The key for the new media to really do great reporting is the old legwork. That's the key, and that's what there's not enough of. There's not enough of in daily journalism by major journalistic institutions, with the exception of some great ones like the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, a few others. The networks do virtually none. So
They wouldn't like to hear that.
well, take a look at what they put on the air.
I do.
They do some. They do some, but they should do more of it. And here's the great danger of the internet culture, which is impatience and speed. And, you know, give it to me now, tweet it, and I'll understand it. And we're going to miss something. And I go back to this theme of we don't know what's really going on, that the culture is not enough tilted toward let's dig deep, let's really find out. In the case, we need more Ben Bradleys. We've got a great new editor at the Washington Post, Marty Barron, who really is, you know, I think works 24/7 and is coming up with ideas and pushing things like Bradley did.
And lots of new reporters they've hired.
Yeah, and
that
Jeff
is
Bezos.
because I imagine that you have a money man now at the Washington Post who is prepared to provide the capital that allows the paper, Marty Barron, to go out and hire new reporters. So what is it, to go back to your point, Carl, about the shortcomings of contemporary journalism? Is it that there is not enough money around? That certainly can't
look
be
at
the
the
case.
networks. Look, you started at Murrow's CBS. You were not expected in the news division to make a profit.
We lost money.
The rest of the network, the entertainment of CBS carried the news division. The networks today could hire 300 reporters each if they used a fraction of the profits from the entertainment. But they won't. They're public companies, they're responsible to stockholders, and there's no interest in doing it whatsoever. But there's another factor, not just the reporting that is being done, but not enough, but there's also, good reporting is the best obtainable version of the truth. That's what Bradley understood. And we don't have enough viewers, readers, citizens who are interested in the best obtainable version of the truth in incomparable numbers. You can't quantify this to what existed 30, 40 years ago.
So that the responsibility of journalism then also rests with the citizens.
Absolutely. And in fact, we have a culture now in which people, instead of, now, can only generalize so much, but millions and millions of people are looking not for the best obtainable version of the truth, but for ideological ammunition that will buttress what they already believe, their orthodoxies, their religious beliefs, their political beliefs. And a lot of good stories get ground up in the maw of this attitude that has nothing to do. Now, at Watergate, you know, one of the things about Watergate is Republicans eventually were responsible for Richard Nixon leaving office. They cast the key votes against Nixon in the House Judiciary Committee. Barry Goldwater led the presidential nominee of his party in 1964,
So you
the
don't
great
think that would happen
conservative.
now?
He led the delegation to the White House that told Nixon he had to resign.
Would that happen
And
now?
very doubtful, because look at the culture of this town. Look at the culture of the state legislatures. It is ideological cultural warfare that's been going on for 25 years, 30 years in this country. And it makes a receptivity to the truth very difficult.
But,
Do you
but
believe-
I mean, we disagree a little on this. I mean, the analysis is right, but in the business, the news business, you have to break through that.
That's right. We don't
and
disagree on that.
if you can't kind of say, oh, it's the citizens' fault they're not listening to us. When people do a good story, it gets circulated. But the culture is different. As we have talked about, the vote to set up the Senate Watergate Committee in 1973 was 77-0. Dozens of Republicans voting to investigate their president. Now you couldn't get a 77-0 vote in the Senate to have more
National
washrooms or
rhubarb-
something
National
like
Rhubarb
that.
Week.
So, but the variable here is, I think, the leaders of these news organizations, and that's where Bradley played a unduplicated role for us when they were making the
But
movie.
he had the Grahams behind him.
Yes,
Very important. Very
And Marty
important.
Barron at the Washington Post today has Bezos, is
Yeah.
that the correct pronunciation, behind him.
Yeah.
Oh, that's fine. In each case, there was a family interest, business interest, responsible interest. That's very rare in American journalism today. Everything is out there on the market, everything is buyable, everything is sellable.
Yeah, but it has an impact. And when they were making the movie version of our book, All the President's Men, about covering Watergate, the director, Alan Pakula, said, who do we get to play Ben Bradley? And they came up with Jason Robards because some people knew him and it was a hard time in his life. And they called him in and they said, we will want you to play Ben Bradley. We're going to pay you $50,000. And Robards, $50,000, my God, that is wonderful. And
How much did they pay Robert Redford to play you?
I don't know.
I'm not going to touch
Did
it.
Hoffman get
I'm
$49,000
not going
playing
to
you?
touch. That's a straight line I'm not going near.
Yeah, right. Good idea. And you have no idea how many women I've disappointed. So they give the script to Robards, and I can't say this word on the air, but you'll get the idea. And so Robards goes home enthusiastically, reads the script, comes back and said, I can't play Bradley. And they said, what do you mean? And he said, well, I read the script. All he does is run around and say, where's the effing story? And they said to him, that's what the editor of the Washington Post does. That's his job. And all you have to do is figure out 15 different ways to say, where's the effing story? And if you see the movie,
That's what
he
he does.
nailed it.
What can journalism do now to turn itself around sufficiently to attract the American people, to win them back? What do you think journalism
By
has to do
telling
now?
the truth.
Good stories, day after day after day
Words,
after
words,
day.
words,
Because one of the
words,
things
words,
about
words.
good stories, inevitably, good stories controvert prejudgment. They go against easy explanations so often. And you know, the best obtainable version of the truth, some people are open to it. Many people are open to it. And the more we do, the more openness there'll be.
But
You talk
sometimes
about-
you get it wrong. And I mean, this is an important reality in this, that you don't understand it. When Ford went on television in September 1974, he'd been president a month, and he announced that he was giving Nixon a full pardon
Right.
for Watergate. Remember,
Right.
I was asleep, didn't see it. Carl called me up, and Carl always, you know, you have the ability to say what occurred with the most drama in the fewest words. And you said, have you heard? And I said, I hadn't heard anything. And you said, the son of a bitch pardoned the son of a bitch. The good news is even I got it. And we thought at the time, you know, it's perfect. It's the final corruption of
cover-up.
Watergate. Yeah, I mean that the guy who led it all gets a pardon, 40 people go to jail. 25 years later, look at this through the eye of 25 years of history, a lot of time to dig into it, talk to Gerald Ford endlessly, look at the legal documents, and it turns out what Ford did was courageous, was gutsy, because
You didn't
his
think so at the time.
Pardon?
You didn't
Yeah,
think so
didn't
at the
think
time.
so.
More
So-
than gutsy. Here was somebody who said later that he gave Nixon a pardon so he could, one, have his own presidency, two, there were great problems in the country at the time, inflation, economic problems, and that the country had to move on from Watergate. And he realized that he might lose his attempt to get elected to the presidency in the race against Jimmy Carter in a couple of years, if he pardoned Nixon. And probably that is why he lost the election. It took such courage, and Ted Kennedy was among those who said the equivalent of the son of a bitch, pardon the son of a bitch that day. And a number, 15 years later or so, Ted Kennedy gave the Kennedy family Profiles in Courage Award to Gerald Ford for that pardon. It's a
And so
great
I have
moment.
just, hang on, Bob.
Okay.
I have just a couple of concluding questions. Quickies, and I'd appreciate quick answers if you do.
Oh, we're not good at that.
I know that. How did you respond to the movie? I mean, how did you enjoy looking at yourself as Robert Redford and you as Dustin Hoffman?
We learned something from it. We were unaware, I think, of how huge a role the nighttime played in our reporting. And you see it in that movie. Every bit of information almost that we obtained at night. And the movie is in darkness, the reporting part. And because
so
we
we've
went
come-
out at night every
We've
night.
come up with this saying, lies during the day, the truth at night.
Another question. You both hit a zenith, probably unparalleled in American journalism, of hitting it at the very top when you were still very young Is that a good or a bad thing?
It is.
It is. Both a good and a bad thing.
I am crushed to hear that we're no longer young.
That's right.
Well, you're not. Seriously, there are any number of young journalists in this audience here tonight, and I'd like to ask you very quickly, no more than 15, 20 seconds each, what is the best advice that you could give to each one of these young people?
Be
Carl.
a good listener. People want to tell the truth if you give them a chance, or what they think is the truth. Don't shove a microphone in their face and run out the door 20 minutes later thinking you know the answers. Let them talk.
And it's the best job in the world. You get to make momentary entries in people's lives when they're interesting, and then get the hell out when they cease to be interesting. And if you're a doctor or a lawyer, you have a lot of routine. You have a lot of oh yeah, I have to deal with that client.
Bedpans.
In the business, in the news business, you start each day, what's going on that has meaning? What's hidden? What don't we know? How do we follow that story? What are people talking about? What do people care about? It's the greatest job in the world.
Greatest job in the world. Unfortunately, I could go on for a bit longer than this, but our time's up. And I want to thank both of you, most sincerely, both of you, for coming on down, for talking to us, for sharing your ideas, for giving us insights into what it was like to cover Watergate. And I would also like to thank all of you who are here, those of you who are here at the National Press Club, and those of you listening or watching on the new technology, because all of us are dependent in the final analysis upon an alert, virile, exciting press, because that, at the end of the day, determines whether we remain a free, virile, and exciting democracy. Thank you guys very much, and that's it for now. I'm Marvin Kalb, and as Ed Moore used to say, good night and good luck. Thank you. Thank you. Good job. Thank you very much. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a wonderful opportunity now where I don't say a word, but you do. And there's a microphone there and a microphone there. And if you have any questions, not speeches, please go over to the two people on either side, ask your question directed at either Bob or Carl. And let's start over here. Identify yourself, please.
Hi, my name is Samuel Morris. I'm a student at GW. I'm a junior. And my question is whether both of you believe that the events would have transpired the way they did if it hadn't been you two working on the story.
What was the question?
Whether the events would have transpired if it hadn't been the two of us working on the story. You know, if history doesn't usually work, you don't know the answer to a question like that, is what I would say.
I would say probably would not have happened. And it would not have happened if Ben Bradley had not been there. I think the three of you made an unmatchable
We ought to say a
troika.
word about Katharine Graham, actually, while we have the opportunity. Yeah. She's the most extraordinary newspaper publisher, perhaps, of her time. I'll give you an example,
please,
of her dedication to the truth and publishing this very, very dangerous story for the Washington Post. About 10 weeks in, soon after that conversation with John Mitchell, I got a call from the guard at the desk downstairs at the Post saying there was a subpoena server there for our notes. And so I said to the guard, well, don't let them upstairs, keep them there. And I called Bradley, and Bradley said, give me a minute. And he called Katharine Graham, and he called me back, and he says, okay, you get out of the office, and they're not your notes, Katharine says, they're her notes. And if anybody is going to go to jail, it's going to be her. And,
that's a great story.
Just think about what that took. And this is at a time when we wrote the Mitchell story, when the Washington Post had finally gone public as a company, And Mitchell and others then proceeded to try and have the Post TV station licenses revoked, which was the lifeblood of the Washington Post company. Challenge,
not
well,
revoke, couldn't revoke.
right, at the time.
Thank
And,
you.
and the business about the going to jail, and then Bradley, of course, who had a great sense of theater, said, Catherine's got the notes. If they come and arrest her or she has to go to jail, can't you see her limousine pulling up to the woman's detention center? And as he put it, our gal getting out and going to jail to protect the First Amendment. And he said that picture would run on the front page of every newspaper in the world.
Probably right. Yes, please.
Good evening, gentlemen. My name is Mark Wino. I'm an alum of GW, as well as a member of the National Press Club, and I work for Kiplinger's Magazine. Could you, in addition to Ben Bradley and Catherine Graham, could you talk about the other editors that helped you craft your stories, and what you learned from them, guys like Howie Simons, Harry Rosenfeld, and Charles Puffenbarger?
And Barry Sussman, who
Was the city editor.
and I'll say a word about Charles Puffenbarger, and then I'll let you answer the question, because Puff never worked at the Washington Post, but he was, when I went to work when I was 16 years old at the old Washington Star, he was really one of my two mentors there. And he was a great, great editor. Learned a lot from him. He then became the chairman of the journalism department at GW, died a while ago, but I learned and have a great debt of gratitude to him. But why don't you talk about
well, I mean,
the
Barry Sussman was the city editor and was really hands-on and gave us lots of guidance and was the theoretician of what all of this was. Harry Rosenfeld was the metropolitan editor and was kind of the spark plug of the operation. And, you know, we were lucky. There was a convergence here of personalities that if you take one piece away, it might not work.
Fascinating. Thank you. Yes, please.
Paulson, George Washington alumnus. I wonder why Frank Will, the security guard, never got the credit he deserved at the Watergate, because if it hadn't been for him, you guys wouldn't have had a story.
That's true, and it's an often asked question, and at the risk of being not disputatious, but he did get credit. And the fact of your question indicates that he does. And obviously, everyone owes Frank Wills a great debt of gratitude for being on the job that night, finding this piece of
it was
tape.
also in the movie,
feel
wasn't
that way.
Nixon wouldn't feel that way.
It was in the movie as well.
And I think he is in the movie.
Yeah.
And so he has been given credit,
Not enough.
but not enough. Not enough.
Next question, please.
You talked about Henry Kissinger.
What's your name, please?
My name is Salem. You talked about Henry Kissinger sitting in the office with Nixon and Haldeman. Why do you think Kissinger got a free pass, more or less, and didn't get any bad press about him going on through the Watergate thing?
Wow, easier to describe the creation of the universe. Kissinger obviously did some good things. I mean, if you read our books, you'll see that there's another side of this, and read some of the other things on him, and there's a controversy. But the question was, did he have criminal knowledge or involvement in some illegal activity? And it was never established.
A gray area.
Yeah, which is...
But perhaps the press itself, I think when we wrote the final days, particularly about Nixon's last year in office, there's an awful lot about Kissinger in that book and what his role was. And interestingly,
in terms of the conspiracy?
In terms of being adjacent to the conspiracy.
Wait a minute. No, Carl, what are you trying to say?
No, I'm trying to
You're
say just...
suggesting something without
wait a
backing
minute.
it up.
There's a big difference between a criminal charge and a criminal charge coming forth and having moral responsibility or sitting and being silent and listening to somebody, say, crack the safe, who's the President of the United States. Kissinger also is very, and has been very smart about his courtship of the press, his courtship of the political establishment. He's brilliant. His use of the English language is incredible, literate in a remarkable way. So all of these things have come together. And
Do you believe that Kissinger was involved in a criminal conspiracy linked?
No. I mean, but Carl, it's an interesting word, adjacent. And
Yeah, but it's a word that says I don't want to say what I'm saying.
No,
it
to the
isn't.
contrary.
It's
To the
adjacent
contrary.
means next to, that he witnessed. I mean, look at the tapes, listen to the tapes and so forth. If you're at CBS and the head of CBS says, you know, let's break the safe, let's blow the safe, let's get in there, are you just going to kind of say, oh, well, another day at CBS? I mean, I hope not. And Carl raised this question on the anti-Semitic marks. I mean, where is Kissinger going to Nixon and saying, look, you don't talk like that around me, please. What are you doing here? Carl and I have speculated many times if Nixon had one good, strong lawyer who would go in there and say, you're the President of the United States. Knock this crap off. Now, it didn't happen because Nixon wouldn't permit it, because Nixon's view of the presidency and his power, as he articulated in the Frost interviews, that if the president does it, it's legal. Well, we are, as last time I checked, a constitutional democracy. And in a constitutional democracy, the president doesn't decide what's legal. The laws do. And you go through, some lawyers have gone through lots of the tapes and said you could indict Nixon for 100 crimes.
Title 18, you could run right through it.
Yeah, I mean, it is just time and time again. It's not just abuse. It's not just illegality. It's, as Carl said, the dog that doesn't bark. It's the smallness of this man. And think about it. Step back. The presidency is a wonderful, powerful office that can do and has done great things for this country and the people of the country. And to blow that chance is one of the tragedies of American history.
Blow that chance, and yet he opened a pathway to China. He's the one who did the Environmental Protection Agency. He did a number of things in addition in striking an arms control agreement with the Russians in 1972. That was an extremely important step away from both superpowers going toward nuclear war. So don't knock the guy the way you are.
Yeah,
It's unfair.
No, wait a minute. It's like the skipper of the Titanic saying, you know, it was a great cruise except for that rock.
I think that's a good joke. But it's a good joke.
It was a great cruise.
It's a good joke, but it doesn't really address the issue.
It does address the issue because, first of all, the opening to China is a great act. Give him credit for that. In terms of EPA, it didn't take a lot of courage. He was a conventional Republican at the time, and he got Republican support for it, fine. But the basics of his presidency, what his presidency was about, really, was criminality. And go back to Vietnam, as we did, and as you have written. That is the index of how awful what happened was, because how many people died because of the cynicism of this president.
I want to be very clear about just a minute. I want to be very clear about this. Richard Nixon did not like me, but I never had any personal negative feelings toward him, or, by the way, toward any president.
Nor did we.
Good. Now, I'm great. I'm delighted to hear that. Your description of Nixon's criminality, I believe, is accurate. I also believe that you have carried this to a point where you are not allowing any
No, we
Positive
just allowed
and-
it.
I
We
just said that
I
the
know, only
opening
because
to
I had
China
said it earlier.
is a
Things.
great achievement. Détente, you can have an argument that détente was the right approach, or that Reagan's approach was the right approach, which was not détente and to be confrontational, but it certainly was an interesting and workable arrangement with the Soviet Union at the time.
Interesting?
I said interesting and workable.
Are you aware of how difficult it was to get that?
Actually, I think that Nixon and Brezhnev were able to form a relationship, and it was very constructive.
And they've used each other.
Of course, I was about to say
and
that.
of course,
They used-
the Soviet-China split. I mean, the CIA was telling Nixon and Kissinger, look, this, you know, in a sense, inviting them, open relations with the Chinese and you will aggravate this split. And there are historians who argue this was low-hanging fruit and obvious. Now, I agree with Carl, it was a good thing. But now wait a minute. Would you want another president
No.
who does some good things, who shreds the Constitution to be in the Oval Office?
No, obviously.
Okay, obviously.
I mean, it's a silly question because it's such
No,
an
it's not
obvious
a
question.
silly-
No, we're
because you're
responding
saying-
to what you asked.
Yeah, you're saying give him a break, kind of.
I am only saying that when we examine, I don't have to say this to you two, you're the best.
Finish.
When you examine anybody, particularly a president, all of it has to be taken into account.
Absolutely.
And that's fine, then we all agree. So what are you arguing about? Over here or over here? I lost track. Let's go there.
Hi, my name's Emily. I'm a freshman at GW. And in my journalism class, we're talking about how journalism falls victim to the culture industry, in which, like, citizens are duped into thinking that news stories are different when in fact they're like carbon copies of each other. Do you think traditional journalism took part in that? Why or why not?
I'm sorry that I missed
I had
that.
trouble hearing it. It was about news stories being the same as, you mean they get picked up?
Yeah, like culture industry in which news
Wait,
stories,
who, the what? Sorry.
culture industry.
The culture, I don't know what the culture industry is, unfortunately. Can you define it for me a little
In
bit?
which citizens are like duped into thinking that news stories are different when in fact they're like carbon copies of each other.
Well, I think that some news stories are carbon copies of each other. Some news stories are different. I don't have a conspiratorial view of the overall production of news in this culture. That'd be my
Okay.
answer.
Well, we've got about 2 more minutes. Yes, please.
To a certain extent, this your earlier conversation segues into this. I was interested in having you comment on what it says about American press, American public, and Richard Nixon. The fact that he was able to a certain extent, resurrect himself.
I would ask.
I missed that resurrection.
Absolutely. I didn't see the tomb open.
Yeah, I mean, he made the effort, but, you know, it goes to the line of questioning, you know, what was this presidency about, and was it a good presidency? And yes, good things happened, but I mean, look at the whole history of this country, and its vitality grows from its Constitution and the adherence to law by the participants, including the citizens, including the president. And the president, I mean, all you have to do is listen to time and time again. Let's get the FBI on here. Let's get the IRS on you. Democrats, opponents. Do you think that's what it says in the law? That, oh yes, the president can get members of the other party or people who are opponents? It does not. It is that there will be equal application of the law. And so we have it time and time again. And it is, if we had presidents like that, we would lose our democracy.
As far as we know, this is a presidency that's really sui generis in in its criminality, that there's nothing like this in our history that we know of.
Were you guys on the enemies list?
No.
No.
No, we were
Were,
friends.
were
We
your
friends.
income taxes ever checked by Richard Nixon?
Don't know.
Well, you would
we
know,
were-
you'd have to file.
We were audited
right.
at one
Were you
point.
audited at the
Yeah,
time of
yeah.
Nixon?
I
Well,
mean,
no,
it was
not,
later.
we were making
Was your phone-
$30,000 a
was
year.
your phone bugged? Was your phone bugged?
You were. I was making 15.
Was your
Not,
phone
not
bugged?
that we know of. Not that we know of, and so forth. So,
Well,
but
all
it
of
was-
those, hang on, all of those things happened
Yeah.
to me, so I don't like the implication that you're attempting to leave, that I am in any way defending Richard Nixon. I was simply
Well,
saying...
your own words, you did, Marvin.
No, 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 my friend. What I did was to say that there were things that he did that you were then, under a little bit of pressure, acknowledging he did.
Didn't he take any pressure?
Well,
No
that's
pressure
good.
whatsoever.
Because I have a feeling that this is not an, what's the word? You have left an impression that is unfair, and I'm calling you on it in front of everybody.
Okay, I don't think so.
And I think
How
that it's
many-
unfair, and you
Let's
don't
ask-
think so?
Well, let's take a vote of the audience.
Yeah,
Let's
no,
divide the house.
No,
Let's do it.
that's unfair.
That's unfair?
That's unfair. But how
See,
many
one person gets
school
to-
boards are sitting around saying, let's name the new local school the Richard M. Nixon School?
Good.
Huh? How many?
None.
No, because they're aware of history and the Constitution.
Absolutely
In the
agree.
sense, and who is going out and running for Senate or Congressman and saying, I'm going to be just like Nixon?
Well, they're
Just
not even saying
happening.
that about Barack Obama.
No, wait, it was Barry Goldwater again. He took us up one night, we went up to his apartment, he got his diary out, and he read it to us about how when he visited Nixon the day before Nixon announced his resignation. And Goldwater said, and he wrote this out, and we have a Xerox of his diary, and he said, we went in there, the congressional leaders, Republican leaders, and Nixon said, well, let's see, I'm going to be impeached in the House, charged in the Senate. Barry, how many votes do I have? And 20? Now, of course, he would need 30 plus, 34.
For acquittal.
For acquittal. And Goldwater says, Mr. President, my count, you have 4. And mine is not one of them. And
Fascinating.
this is the conscience of the Republican Party. And what Goldwater told us, the reason Nixon left is simple. Too many lies, too many crimes.
Absolutely, and I want to thank both of you very much for being here because you're terrific reporters. Thank you. I appreciate it very much. Thank you all for being here as well.
Thank you.